Good evening, welcome everybody. My name's John Bonning. I'm the Commercial Director here at the Building Centre. I'm going to be very brief tonight because we've got an excellent panel of speakers and we've got a host who also is going to do the introduction to the speakers. So for me, it's really to say thank you to Arup for sponsoring the Retrofit exhibition upstairs and the larger programme, and for tonight for pulling together what is a very important subject area in respect of our need to retrofit our existing building stock. Couple of housekeeping matters. Please can you ensure your mobiles are switched off, and there are no fire tests tonight, so if you do hear a continuous ringing, please exit the way you came into the room and the Building Centre staff will direct you out. So for me, it's just to introduce Mike Edwards, Director at Arup and Head of Net Zero Buildings, and he will introduce the team for you tonight, the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, welcome everybody to Retrofit Meets Fire Safety. So I'm Mike Edwards, I'm a Director at Arup and I'm a part of our Applied Sustainability team and working closely with colleagues leading our Retrofit at Scale business. So we established this internal task force last year to ensure we bring the whole firm and as much of the industry as possible together to solve the challenge of making our built environment ready for the future at pace and at scale. We're committed to a systems approach to retrofit as a multi-benefit action to support our health and that of the planet. So the majority of our projects, particularly in the retrofit space, require us to take a full multidisciplinary view, to consider all the competing requirements from user comfort to environmental performance and to safety and compliance. So as sponsors of this fantastic exhibition, we're very keen that the session be dedicated specifically to fire safety and the strategies and methodologies that might be employed to integrate this into other design solutions. And obviously the upcoming Building Safety Act brings this into sharper focus than ever before. In the domestic space, where interventions on people's homes are generally disruptive, often unwelcome, we must avoid as far as possible the need to go in and make repeated visits. It's a really important point. So a coordinated approach to planning the interventions we want to make that achieve multiple objectives at the same time, like improved thermal efficiency, climate adaptation to overheating. If you went to our previous session on that, you remember the session we did there. And combining that with building safety is really needed. And it's needed at every level: cross-departmental policy planning, funding allocations, design, installation, and marketing. Arup has a hard-won reputation for fire safety, the discipline having been established almost 50 years ago, and now we have a global network numbering about 300 people, with about 100 in the UK. And it's probably not an exaggeration to say that pioneers like Margaret Law led the creation of fire engineering as a specialist discipline at Arup. So this global network allows us to rise and scan and gather and learn from experiences as many other countries grapple with the scale of the housing retrofit challenge, which is rooted in decarbonisation, but can and must deliver wider outcomes. Earlier this year, we completed a research exercise for a large combined authority, which looked at the opportunity to deliver improved fire safety in funded retrofit across both domestic and non-domestic sectors. And in this work, we drew upon a global network I've just mentioned to offer relevant case studies and insight. So from our team, Owen and Judith, who join us this evening, we're both heavily involved. And I definitely look forward to hearing some of those learnings coming through in the discussions. So as John said, we've got a fantastic panel. I'm going to now hand over to Judith, Director in our Fire Engineer Consultancy, who's going to chair the speakers and the Q&A. I hope you enjoy the session and get something out of it. Thank you very much.
Right, so I do need to acknowledge first that while we stand on the shoulders of Margaret Law, we are competing tonight with the Women in Fire Awards Night, which is why many of the women that have been helping out in making this event happen are there because they're up for awards and not here. So I'm very grateful for those of you who have actually made it to this event tonight because we're in strong competition. We are seeing building safety and fire safety very much in the centre of much of the conversations following the Grenfell Tower fire and much of the other problematic buildings that have come to light and are literally on the eve of the new regime that is kicking in 2 days' time on the 1st of October. Within that regime, we'll have about 12,500 higher risk buildings undergoing a completely new safety review regime But we need to also consider that we have some 27 million other homes that are not under that scrutiny that also need considerations and retrofit. We have most of our buildings dating back to pre-1919, where the climate was different, and if we look forward, the climate forecasts are actually radically changing. So in that, we do need to consider holistically how we get our buildings retrofitted, but also find opportunities to improve safety, which unfortunately, the past recent history has proven we could and do need to do better. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Owen O'Loughlin, who is an associate in Arup. He is based in London and is very passionate about decarbonisation in the built environment and working very hard to strive and deliver equitable fire safety. He's a chartered engineer and delivers through all stages of the asset lifecycle, design, construction and operation for projects around the world. He's been heavily involved in the research that Mike introduced earlier and is heading up our global fire safety skills network for structural fire safety engineering. He is going to share with you some of the insights from that research, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks, Mike. I guess from a fire safety engineer's point of view, the scene is set, the decarbonisation need is very clear, but the urgency is very clear also, and this presents some challenges and opportunities as well for us within fire safety engineering. So as Judith and Mike mentioned, we did quite a bit of research on this subject, this interface between retrofit and fire safety in the past year or so. And I'd like to share just maybe some of the headlines or the key topics, key learnings from that here tonight. So I guess starting with the challenges first and starting at the domestic scale, it's great to see the uptick in bottom-up and top-down efforts to install solar PV, re-insulate or insulate homes, battery energy storage systems, move to heat pumps, and EV charging points and other things. But the risk or the challenge with this movement of pace is that current codes and guidance and the other controls we have in place to control fire safety can't keep up. And we also have the backdrop, obviously, of the inertia of all of the change coming through in the Building Safety Act, which will ultimately lead to better consolidated guidance, better processes for delivering safety at all scales of development. But in the interim, we have some voids and gaps. So we need to be mindful of not learning from the mistakes of the past. We've seen overseas some retrofit programs that were rolled out very quick with not much of a feedback loop or kind of mechanism to review trials and kind of refine the processes, which led to large scale changes needing to be made or things needing to be redone. We have seen more locally as well in the UK quite recently in high profile in the news, the foam insulation in roofs and what that's led to in terms of rotting timber roof structure. So we need to be mindful of all the different factors kind of that might affect the viability and safety of our retrofits and not roll them out unknowingly. But equally as an opportunity, there's a lot to learn from other countries as well in terms of how they're delivering some retrofit solutions. Just as one example, and we can get to more in the discussion, in Canada we're aware of the pretty rigorous approaches there are to delivering solar PV at domestic scale or at much larger scales. That includes structural appraisals for correct framing that can avoid undue bending of the PVs leading to arcing and cracking and fires, to really rigorous controls and information from the fire safety side and the electrical side in terms of installation. There's also, at the slightly larger scale, or where this becomes more acute, is the installation of our existing building stock. Obviously there's issues to work through and challenges to work through at domestic scale as well, but at a larger scale, the non-combustible insulation solutions that the current regs in fire safety and the guidance are pointing us towards present practical challenges for delivery. Mineral wool is heavier and you need more of it, and it's harder to work with than some of the foam combustible solutions. So we have this balance or this kind of tension here to work through. And I think the message or the challenge to us as an industry trying to think about this holistically is where is that balance point? What are the right targets to set in terms of retrofitting for energy performance? Think of all the other measures that can be part of the energy improvement process. And then looking at at the fire safety strategy holistically as well, considering the height of buildings. So we want to measure once, or measure twice rather, and cut once. So that's more joined up thinking at a kind of a policy and guidance side, and also project to project. So there are other opportunities then as well on the practical side. Obviously fire safety interventions are going to hopefully be driven through the Building Safety Act to a degree. We're going to certainly in higher risk buildings be having to evidence safety and put measures in place to take all reasonable steps towards improving safety in buildings. But there won't always be project work, and we do have this challenge of trying to find funds, identify funds and projects for these fire safety remediations. With retrofit, we have works that are being proposed to buildings, and there are potentially opportunities within our regulatory framework to change the language around and the focus away from not making buildings any worse when we go and do works and where we make change, to making all reasonable efforts to improve safety, accessibility, and all the other factors that might be alongside improving energy performance or mold. So I think with that, I think my provocation to the room and our kind of thoughts are to try and bring more of this holistic thinking to the fore, to try and share knowledge, share kind of ideas. I think there's a once in a generation opportunity to improve building safety at scale.
Next, we're very pleased to have Dan Hollis join us from Clarion. He's the Building Safety Director there and is leading a team who works on investigating and remediating fire and structural safety risks, and prepares a very significant portfolio of buildings for the incoming Building Safety Act obligations. Dan has worked previously for other local authorities and housing associations, primarily in London, and is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Building and the Chartered Institute of Housing, and a member of the Institution of Fire Engineers. He's got a particular interest in retrofit, with much of the portfolio that he's looking after being existing, and he's some very interesting insights to share from his career in building safety in social housing.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so Clarion are like the UK's largest housing association, largest landlord. So we've got, from a residential perspective, we've got a real obligation to make sure our buildings are safe and to make sure that they're sustainable as well. Now, from my perspective, as a building safety director, I've spent a lot of time looking at, how combustible are the external wall systems? How, what are the fire risks in the building? How do you break that down? What do you find out? What do you find out, and then how do you fix that problem? And and we did, from the point of the Grenfell Tower fire, we've been doing that in, an organised and structured way. We sort of realised within 12 months, we were pulling down these buildings. We were pulling down pulling off the insulation, saying the insulation's combustible. And we thought, well, really what we're doing is we're solving a problem by making the building safe. But actually, what we really ought to be doing is having a holistic solution to this building that addresses not just the fire safety or the building safety aspects, but actually how sustainable these buildings are. So what insulation are you putting back, to what standard? How does that interact with other aspects of the building in terms of the heating source, the ventilation of the building? And actually, I suppose what we realised is that, a couple of things. First of all, we didn't know our buildings well enough. And if you don't know your buildings and if you don't know your data, then it's really difficult to solve any problems. And I think that's sort of like that's where we started to unpeel it. And what we've done over the last 5 or so years is peel those layers back, and then try and build them up in a more constructive, holistic way. Trying to think before we do, trying to understand the data, trying to use some of the digital aspects of innovations that are around to create the models that can then look at what the different solutions are. And I think and also think as a large landlord, what is our real function in terms of our technical capability to be able to do this? Do we know as much as we know? What extra sort of like support and advice do we need? We had to go through those different processes, and I suppose fundamentally we've had to say, look, actually, our culture's got to change, and if we change our culture and we change our approach to how we manage our buildings, then we have got the real chance to be able to not just make our buildings safe, but also make them sustainable. And, I lead a team. My team's got 50 people in it. And I suppose that the journey that we've been on is that a lot of us came to this from a safety aspect, but actually we've ended up in a position where we're looking at it as from a sustainability perspective. And actually there isn't necessarily an overarching view, overarching perspective saying one's better, one's more important than the other. But actually, unless you fix one, you can't fix the other. If these buildings are going to be, we're going to continue to use them. My favourite sort of like, understanding point came when I was talking through this with one of my colleagues. He said, Dan, the thing is that net zero is going to happen whether the human race is part of it or not. And I said, oh yeah, that's right. And I thought he was being glib, but actually, it's true, isn't it? And actually, if we want to be part of that, sort of solution, then we've got to make sure that we have that approach. Anyway.
Next, we now have two Richards. So the first Richard is Richard Battis, Fire Safety Team Leader from the HSE. He is heading up the HSE's Science and Research Centre in the Peak District and has travelled down specifically for this event. Thank you very much. He's joined the HSE's research division after finishing a PhD on LPG vessel explosions, and at Buxton now has been part of the fire safety team for over 30 years, so a lot of knowledge to contribute here, leading for it for about half the time. A big part of his work has been supporting the HSE's construction inspectors looking at fire risks on building sites, from small refurbishments to major tunnelling work. And like all of us, he's trying to keep up with understanding the additional obligations under the Building Safety Act and the incoming Building Safety Regulator. Glad you're on that journey too. And what it will mean for his work in the future. And until things becomes clear, he's going to enlighten us with his insight from approaching retrofit from a traditional health and safety perspective, which is actually, in terms of culture, really important. So, Richard, over to you.
Right. Yes, as I say, I've been in HSE a long time, and up until very, very recently, HSE has not had any real interest in occupied buildings. HSE has been the regulator of workplaces, and as soon as a house has been built and handed over to its occupiers, the responsibility has moved elsewhere. But certainly for the higher risk buildings, that has very much changed. I'm not sure what that means for me. But certainly one thing that in looking at that in terms of retrofit, it's very true that the building safety regulator's focus is on a very small fraction of the total number of buildings that will benefit from being part of a retrofit process. So there's an awful lot of buildings that are having work done on them. And HSE is then, when that work's being done and it is a building site, HSE's traditional construction focus comes into play, and while quite rightly the major focus for fire safety round retrofit is on making buildings that are going to be safe for the rest of their lifetimes, it's also true that probably the most risky period for fire is that period where they're actually being worked on. Not only are you putting in new things that may have fire risks, insulation's an obvious candidate for that, but all sorts of how you put things in have those fire risks associated with them, and you're actually working on them. You know, in the end, the insulation is going to be hidden behind the protection that it has in the finished building. When you're working on it, it doesn't have that protection. So it's equally, not equally important. It is important that, as well as thinking, are we going to be making a safe building? It's important to think, and are we making a building that can be retrofit safely? So I think that's really the where I'm coming from just at the minute is, what do people need to do to be able to work safely in that environment? And particularly for retrofit, where you're talking about doing work probably in occupied buildings. You've got then the risk to not just people working doing the retrofit, who are by and large going to be capable, fit, awake, and hopefully even slightly trained as to what they should do in the event of a problem. You've also got people who may be infirm, elderly, asleep if there are problems that carry on overnight, who may be really at risk in the event of fire issues caused by the retrofit process. So assessing what those risks are and having appropriate approaches to them, and thinking about that right at the design stage as well, is really important to keeping that level of safety that you're going to give people at the end of the process, keeping that level of safety as you go through the process.
Thank you, Richard. Next, Richard, is Richard Clark, Senior Engineer at NFCC. And Richard started his career over 20 years ago as a firefighter in the London Fire Brigade, and then moved after 3 years into the fire safety regulatory world at South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, where he held a variety of roles over the subsequent 13 years. During that time, he also completed a Master of Science in Fire and Explosion Engineering at the University of Leeds, graduating with distinction in 2013. Congratulations. And currently works with the NFCC Council as a senior engineer with a protection reform unit, which represents the voice of the fire service within the current changes in the building safety regulation. So he's a very busy man. He's also the chair of the NFCC Fire Engineering and Technical Standards Group, and represents NFCC on a range of British standards committees, including those for fire engineering and smoke and heat control systems. So we get a view from the fire service world from Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. The fire service is an interesting point in these buildings, because actually we deal with most buildings in one way or another across many different ways. From the domestic point of view, which I think Owen started with as well, we deal with the risks within the home. So we try and educate people as to kind of how fire may affect them. One of the issues with retrofitting is that it's introducing new hazards into the built environment. So one of the major concerns we have at the moment is around things like battery energy storage systems, or the use of lithium-ion batteries in general. We're seeing quite a lot of reports on the news and various outlets of battery fires, and people don't necessarily recognise what the hazard is or what the issue around that is. So it can be that you've got something that was previously thought of being quite benign, things like bikes, which lots of people in London store within their own flats, possibly charge at night, which become quite a serious hazard, because you've got things like the potential for fire within them, but also the potential for a vapour cloud explosion within their front room, which is just not generally how we perceive fire. The other issue we have from a fire service perspective is that actually we're expecting firefighters to go into these buildings, so they need to understand what's there, and we don't always know. So I think Owen mentioned things like photovoltaic panels, which are being installed on lots of people's roofs, which actually changes the structure of that, because roofs aren't necessarily meant to be load-bearing. They're not necessarily meant to survive a fire. So I've seen recent reports on the news of things like a fire in a photovoltaic battery in a loft area, which caused the gable end of a whole row of houses to collapse. And they're not necessarily things that we are trained to recognise or know about. One of the issues with things like PV panels is that there is no national register where they are. So you could have one installed on your house, and certainly in the fire service we wouldn't know about it because it's a permitted change to your building. We also have similar concerns when we're looking at kind of large-scale developments, so where retrofit is meeting things like office conversions into housing. So that's changing the risk within buildings themselves. There's a range of things that we can have concern around there. From a firefighting perspective, it can be that the structure may behave differently. Things like the requirement for compartment floors is different, so the amount of time that a fire can burn in one compartment before spreading may be different. Often when we see these are subject to the building regulations regime at the moment, but if we see them coming across our desks, usually one of the concerns is that people either haven't checked that compartmentation, or it's not seen as being kind of cost beneficial or proportionate to do anything about it. I think Dan mentioned the actions that have happened following on from Grenfell, and part of that we've seen that actually a lot of buildings aren't constructed in the way that we would think that they should have been. So we're seeing lots of issues with the potential for internal fire spread, which can be exacerbated if that building wasn't necessarily designed to behave in a certain way to start with. Looking at some of the issues we've been mentioning around kind of the new safety regulator, one of the things I was asked to talk about is, will the new regime change things? And we hope so, is the outcome from that. One of the things that I think was mentioned earlier was this idea of non-worsening, and that's one of our concerns around the fact where a building is repurposed, is that at the moment the requirement to improve standards isn't always pursued by building control bodies in the way that it might be, because if you're not affecting the structure, then the requirement is that you don't make it any worse than it was before. So we would also like to see the implementation of the idea that where you're doing these developments, you actually improve safety systems to try and bring them up to a more modern standard. I know that sometimes proportionality gets in the way of that, so you may not be able to, it may not be cost beneficial in some circumstances, but there are certain aspects, so things like means of escape for people who require kind of assistance out of a building, or use of lifts and things like that. We think that where you're improving building stock, you should be taking advantage of the opportunity to actually provide an equity of escape to everyone within the building, because they're not always designed on that basis. We used to design around a very ableist kind of methodology, which isn't the way that we use modern buildings. There are methodologies which should help with that. So things like the safety case requirements are supposed to have a review of your building to ensure that you are providing safety for everyone. The devil with that will be in how it's actually pursued by the regulator itself, how we put that across. A lot of the regulation that we are waiting to come in next week is about proportionality and what is reasonable. And the issue is that if people start using tools like cost-benefit analysis to do these kind of things, we hope that we don't end up with a regime which lots of landlords may try and say, well, we could do things, but it's not cost-beneficial to do that, so we can't. It creates a kind of an interesting perspective of whether actually we're putting cost before safety. I come from the fire service, we put safety before everything else because we don't generally think in commercial terms like that. But I do understand that's part of the evolution of buildings, as we need to do that. The issue with that is that certainly the fire safety regime is about, say, risk to life. So if you're not considering that, it can be an offence under the fire safety order. So we need to find out where that middle ground is. Certainly as regulators, we need to understand what proportionality means and what people should be doing to look after the safety of people within their buildings.
Thanks very much. So we now have time for questions to the panel, and we have a roaming mic available to assist. If there are questions you would like to pose to the panel, I would be happy to take them. Otherwise, I have some pre-prepared as well that I can throw in to get the conversation going. I'll make a start. So you mentioned, Richard and Owen, some of the challenges that exist when retrofit is being integrated into existing buildings, and I wanted to just explore that a little bit more as to the differences where that happens in a domestic scale, because certainly from the research we have done, there was a lot of learning for me personally, because we don't normally do that sort of work in Arab, we're not always involved, to share, because I think it is important for other, and I know there's a lot of fire engineers in the audience, to have a broader appreciation of that type of work and how that gets overseen. Owen, maybe you can pick that one.
Yeah, there's probably lots to cover here, and there's lots of different technologies. Richard picked up part of it, and specifically around things like e-bike charging and EV charging, which are very much, they're not even really an installation necessarily. They're something that you can introduce very much yourself. Hi. So yeah, there's a part of just understanding where we actually have an ability to control what gets done with these retrofits at all. So, for example, PV, again mentioned no national register for a start, but also in terms of the guidance, a lot of it is focused on electrical installation only from a practical point of view, and the coverage of fire safety aspects is quite narrow, often related to product fire safety, and certainly doesn't promote thinking of the building holistically. So you can imagine scenarios where you may have a battery storage system or a PV inverter up in an attic where you don't have any detection. You might have insulation up there. You'll certainly have some combustible roof structure, perhaps in a domestic context. And you may even be part of a terrace with party wall breaches that you're not really aware of. It's up on the roof, not typically really a massive life safety hazard, but you're introducing some combinations of ignition risks and fire load. So that's definitely something that, as I mentioned earlier, some other countries have a bit more of a start to finish framework for. And we hope that things like that can be looked to, and we draw out some of those in our research as well. And that can be fed into how these schemes are controlled. So I haven't mentioned the word competent person schemes yet, but I mean that's to us as fire engineers in kind of large practices. We don't often work on the type of projects that would install PV at any kind of domestic scale. They're done under schemes that don't follow the normal paths that we would through building regulations B1 to B5. There's some controls at a kind of an individual level or a party level at competency. And there's opportunities there, hopefully, to improve the emphasis on fire safety within those schemes, the gateways for doing those works, maybe even linking back through then to the funding and the access you might be able to get in terms of grants for doing these things in your home. And that would apply equally to battery energy storage systems. Heat pump conversions is another one. Maybe don't need to dwell on it a huge amount, but there's some interesting challenges around the selection of different heat pump refrigerants. There's a move to reduce chlorofluorocarbons and drive towards certain types of heat pump refrigerants under the F-gas regulations, which is a good thing, obviously, from health and safety in a kind of broader sense, but some of them have higher, or the alternatives have higher flammability kind of characteristics. And if we're not careful, that'll kind of be forgotten in the pursuit of these other objectives. We need to integrate across some of those things as well. And then again, link those back through to the ways you get access to funding for these and the ones that can be allowed and purchased on the market. There's some guidance. There's a PASS 2038-35 that is geared towards retrofit. So a guidance and standard on what to think about when you're doing retrofit works. that should hopefully help us put some manners on how to do these. But the cross kind of relationship of different hazards and different characteristics in buildings isn't as drawn out in the current version. There are things coming and training to align with that as well, and we're hoping through kind of some of the work we've done and the context we've made to try and add into the direction of that. So kind of on the domestic scale side of things.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I have a question regarding non-high-risk buildings. There's no requirement to install non-combustible insulation, so inevitably there will be combustible insulation installed, which triggers higher risk. Should we actually take the approach that only non-combustible insulation should be installed? And if so, who should make that decision? Because on small-scale retrofits, rarely there is an architect or a fire engineer or anyone with qualifications to actually make that decision. So at the moment, as we all know, we have that massive problem, and someone should actually make that decision so all designers we know where to stand, because it's very difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose from our, so if you think, so Clarion has got 125,000 properties, about half of those are in flats. We've only got HRBs, we've only got, so any buildings which are above 6 stories, we've only got 90 of those buildings. We've got something like 7,000 whole buildings which are below 18 metres. So from and lots of those have combustible materials on the outside. I suppose, fundamentally, if I was to say, look, would it be the best use of resources, the limited resources we've got, to look at, how you develop those buildings without any combustible materials on the outside? I'm not sure it's the best approach. I would personally take a more proportionate approach, thinking about the building holistically as a system and all the different elements that you've got within there. Whether you've got a suppression system in there, what sort of routes of escape, what sort of aspects as a whole do you have to make sure that this building is livable in. That's not to say it's not a serious issue, and you should consider it. And just to give you an example about how we don't say that, Clarion or the engineers that we work with say that's a problem. If I look at so we've done about 470 external wall system investigations, and about 200 of them are on buildings which are 4 stories or below. 4 stories or below, so below 11 metres. And actually, something like 25% of those, we say, from the investigations we've undertaken, that there's remedial work that we need to undertake to make sure that the external wall system's safe. So that's sort of and that's from what we consider a proportionate approach. And that you can put those combustible materials on buildings which are below 11 metres, and so. It's not saying that you can't use those materials, but you've got to use those materials in a considered way that does, make the building holistically a relatively safe place for our residents to live in. Sometimes I can imagine I would have found that really difficult to answer that way, say 5 years ago. But I think because people immediately think, oh gosh, because it's got those combustible materials, you've got to get it off. But I think what I've learned over the last few years in particular is that's I suppose that's my considered view.
And maybe if I can add to that, I think it is important to look at the wider picture. So who live in these buildings? How many different parties are within that? What's the structure? What are the other hazards that are present there? And how tight a control can you have over the construction quality? Because the combustible materials rely on many other safety features that you'll never see again because they're behind cladding and they have a limited lifespan. So it's thinking really carefully across not just the design now, but also how it's getting constructed, how it might get maintained, and the overall lifespan of that building, and the risk acceptance of the client ultimately. There are some that just don't want it on their buildings. So it's important to appreciate the different levels of risk that people are happy to carry. And some are very informed clients like Carlarian who have gone through that process themselves, and others would prefer to not need to consider that. So I think there isn't, unfortunately, a simple answer as you'd probably expected. We had other questions. Could you introduce yourself as well so we know who we're addressing?
Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm responsible for the Mayor of London's climate programme and also his retrofit programmes. So I think about this quite a lot. I wondered if you could tell us that the retrofit supply chain is really immature in terms of expertise, skills, number of people, even to do the work that we need for climate change and net zero, let alone do it in a way that is safe, that you've described, where you bring sustainability and safety together. And at the same time, over the last few years, we've really struggled with the supply of retrofit materials, and that was particularly bad during COVID, but even now it's still a bit of a struggle. And I wondered if you could comment, I don't know if this is a fair question, but how much do you think this is a question of the availability of affordable, fire-safe, decent energy performing materials, or how much of it is that stuff exists, but people just don't know how to use it? Like, we're short of retrofitters anyway, and then you're asking them to know both about retrofit and energy performance and fire safety. Is it out there, but just not many people know about it, or is it actually the materials themselves have got real trade-offs?
Who would like to take that? Owen, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are many factors, and at different scales. So maybe if we look at the larger scale first, there shouldn't be a need for one party to hold all of the knowledge in terms of how to get that retrofit design right, and you'd hope that fire engineers, and structural engineers and architects would be involved in a major retrofit, and there's different gateways obviously you go through. So we'd hope that in terms of getting the design right and identifying what needs to be done, that can be done. There's some practical challenges as I mentioned though. If we're trying to meet modern new build and even the retrofit energy performance requirements set out in Part L, you will be left with some, and you're trying to meet the non-combustible insulation requirements for buildings over 18 metres, you will be left with very few options. So I don't think it will be a question of not being familiar with the materials. It'll be the cost and the structural implications and the practical challenges of getting those solutions to work. So we have a question then: do we not retrofit the buildings at all and provide no insulation, or do we flex a little bit on the energy requirements, at least for the wall component, and then look at the building holistically, considering fire as another part of the holistic study? Or do we retrofit internally? So obviously there's challenges and implications there on value and disruption to tenants, exactly. And there are some products that are less weighty, less thick, but they're massively more expensive. They're nanogel materials and other kind of, vacuum insulated panels that, are much more slim and could maybe be an internal solution. But they're not cheap, at least not yet. So there's probably a journey on product availability too. I think in the lower domestic side of things, if we're talking still about insulation and retrofitting homes, again, you've got the challenges with things being done inbound. You've got obviously the external challenges of Georgian and Victorian and Edwardian houses just not being, that not being a route necessarily at all. So maybe there's a decision around A, can it be done internally? B, obviously if you've got cavity walls, that's an option. But what other things can be done as part of the overall strategy to retrofit? Yes, we need to upskill on the supply chain, but there's some things that aren't really going to necessarily be just curtailed by their familiarity, and it's some of it is what can actually be achieved through planning and kind of elements that side aesthetically. Compliance, Part L regs, there's kind of a Venn diagram there that might not have a middle at the moment. The circles might be sitting apart from each other.
Hi, Audley English, architect and MMC manufacturer. Our recently developed EWS system is non-combustible, and the reason why we've gone down that route, and we can address passive house as well, is that retrofitting from the inside is much more disruptive. So we've come up with our own system, which is patented now, or going through patent, which it's for low-rise and also high-rise building. And with our system, it allows for windows and doors to be integrated into the fabric of the system as well. So that's also going through patented solutions. So we think that the way to retrofit is from the outside of the building, because then you can get away with having heat pumps, because then you can rely on having electrical heating, and you don't need to have, as I said, heat pumps because of the efficiency of the building. So you don't need to go to nano insulation. You know, there is other means on the market. So I just thought I'd just bring that to your attention.
Thank you. That's good to hear. We had another question over there, too.
Hi there. First of all, thank you so much.
Sorry, can you, the mic?
Sorry.
Yeah,
Hi.
perfect.
My name's Nikhil Vaswani. I'm a sustainability consultant at Turner & Townsend. My question was more along the lines of the commercial objectives of organizations. I'm curious about what sort of incentive we could provide to help landlords, be them private or public, adopt more measures towards fire safety in social housing or private.
I suppose motivations. You've got the stick effect of the Building Safety Act, which has 2 years in prison and unlimited fines. So that's quite a motivation for. When I say to, I was saying today to our investment committee, who were looking at the new developments and saying, like, why should you do this? And the big thing I said is that you get a building that's occupied and you've not complied with all the regulations, and you know that, then someone's going to come looking for you, and the people who are making those decisions will be the ones that will be accountable. So that's quite a hard, and I think that's if I'm honest, I think that's the way that that organisations are looking at this particular moment in time. I think in terms of fire safety in general, there is, or broadly building safety, there is a much broader sort of like objective about being a long-term landlord. So Clarion as an organisation is 6 years old. If we want to still be here sort of like 20, 30, 40 years managing those buildings as the custodians of those buildings, then we've got to put in place those safety measures that mean that we have that good relationship that with our residents, that they can trust us, that they know that we will act responsibly and in a reasonable way to look after their interests, whether that's from a fire safety perspective, whether that's from a just a normal repairs and maintenance perspective, or whether it's from a retrofit perspective. I think the thing that if I'm looking at like how organisations work and how they're motivated, also it is generated by the government have an influence in terms of the targets they set and the resources that go towards that. But any organisation that thinks purely about government targets or purely about whether they're going to get caught by the regulations is not really going to be, is not really going to be able to have a sustainable approach to its buildings over a long period of time. And I think those that show leadership and show that they have the right culture to be able to change are the ones that will, that will shine for the longest period.
We had a question at the front here as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I think culture is the key to a lot of that. The safety case regime hopefully will help drive that, because it's not looking at minimum standards anymore, it's looking at what you need for that building. I think too often regulation is about kind of what can we get away with rather than what we should be doing. And I think kind of Dan put the point across, if you want your organisation to thrive, then you should be looking at being more responsible to what is best for those buildings.
An optimist, and I love the optimism from the guys here, but as a fire safety professional, I'm not actually as afraid of Clarion not being motivated. As a sector, I'm afraid of the ones that aren't motivated, and they do need to rely on the stick. And I think when we talk about it a little bit at Arup, we're recently trying to see like what nodes can you turn to have the most lasting or holding effect. I think you mentioned the non-worsening kind of part of building regulations 3 and 4. Ultimately with retrofit probably needing to happen in most or many buildings. You've got works happening, and when works happening in buildings, as I said earlier, you've got a chance to control them, and if you can control them through the regs, you can set the targets. And if the target is you need to make reasonable improvements, I'm not too bothered if they're commercially incentivized or not. They're going to have to do it to meet the regs, and they'll find the market, and we will find the ways that they can make reasonable improvements. And it may be that a lot of the really nitty-gritty difficult stuff, like improving your structural fire resistance and finding out every bit of compartmentation to meet kind of modern expectations, will prove very difficult. But retrofitting residential sprinklers, with all the benefits that can bring you in other ways in terms of obviously safety, but what the communication of safety and what it means for kind of how you can manage the building, and maybe mitigating other concerns, single stair, things that are just wildly short of modern codes, could be worth it.
Thank you. We had a question at the front.
Thank you all for a very stimulating discussion. My name's Edith Blenner-Hassett. I'm a building services engineer at Arup, and I just wondered, Dan, you spoke about how you don't actually know your buildings, and I think in retrofit this has got to be a big challenge to say how do you know what the building is constructed of in terms of compartmentation, insulation, all of these things, and how far do you go in terms of investigation? People have been in there for 10 or 15 years hacking around, retrofitting all sorts of things, particularly building services, I would think. So I'm just wondering what the panel's view might be about how far you go or should go or can go with surveying without, again, tearing the whole thing asunder before you start.
Well, one of the things that we've been doing for our high risk buildings, we've been creating digital models, so we're scanning the 89 high risk buildings that we've got with a particular focus on fire and structural safety. So when we're going, and we've done it ourselves. So we've hired a scanner. Actually, we scanned our office. Was our first sort of our first wave. I think it was about £173 for the day, and we scanned the office and we learned about it because we wanted to know, I suppose, what when we engaged a company to do the scanning for us, how it would work. And what we realised is that if we did it ourselves, then we learned a lot more about the buildings, and we could focus on what we wanted. And that's what we've ended up doing now. So we've scanned all our buildings and we've created a point cloud, and then we created a digital model, and we realised, wow, that looks nice. And then actually, what you've then got to do is find some useful information from that to be able to do. And then once you think, well, how do you get your useful information? Well, you've got to structure it and organise it in a coherent way that meets the targets. And that's been the really difficult bit, saying, actually, what's a priority for us? Fire and structure, but how can we then integrate that with some of the issues around making our buildings more sustainable. And that's essentially that's the journey that we're on. And what it's made us do is think about the hierarchy of data and structure about how that fits together, and then to be able to find that information and then use it in that constructive way. And now that sounds quite easy, but it's not. And especially so it's quite easy to do in a single building, but what it's not easy to do is on a scale. So the meta impact of having all that information together to be able to work constructively to develop a solution is, I suppose, the route that we're heading down. Now that's really, I suppose, that's like a quarter answer, in the sense that it's you've got to that point and you've discovered this, and actually what you need to do, what we really need to do is develop that further, get to find out some more information, put a building at scale about developing the program, which we've got the idea for, but that does take time, and then develop that across in a consistent way across the whole portfolio of the buildings that we've got.
Can you tell it's going to be hosting a Golden Thread event tomorrow morning?
Practicing tonight, very well done. I think...
Can I just...
Yeah.
I think another part of that question is really round about how you build in flexibility to do different things in different situations, and also how you build in competence in the people who are actually doing the work, because the more competence and the more flexibility you have at the point of actually doing the work, the less information you need in planning it. So I think that there's a challenge, a whole range of challenges there, and how you incorporate those into a commercial process as well is going to be a challenge, very definitely.
So I wanted to add also, just from my perspective, I think an important point is to think about what the consequences of not knowing, right? So how important is the bit that you don't know, and what are the potential implications, and can you accept a degree of uncertainty because of the rest of the building and you knowing enough about other parts of the building, or are you actually potentially putting people seriously at risk because the thing you are not knowing is a structural stability in a building where you have vulnerable people, or we have a very extended evacuation time, for example. So I think that needs to be taken in the context of how the building is expected to operate, what are the hazards in it, and what sort of structure are you dealing with? Does it have known vulnerabilities? And we are at a period of time where we're discovering more about our structures as well. So we know aerated concrete's in the news a lot. There's some history that has led to massive disruption. There's other structural forms that have known weaknesses. So I think it needs to be a very targeted approach. And we do have a better feedback loop now than we've ever had with cross-reporting. So if anyone isn't aware of it, please do subscribe. It is a fabulous resource, an ability to confidentially report concerns, and is something that the construction industry historically has been very bad at if you compare us with other industries like the aviation sector, who are not perfect either. But I think in terms of passing on near misses, which is really important for us to learn from, we can't continue to regulate by disasters. That is a route to inform decision making. More questions? Excellent. Keep them coming.
Hi. Sorry. Hello. Hi. Ben Oram, Head of Technical, Buckley Gray Owen Architects. I don't know if I speak, probably not for every architect, but a lot of us are very... our entire lives have been revolving around the Building Safety Act and the new legislation coming in on Sunday. What I think a lot of us are finding is that although there was some guidance, a fair amount of guidance and sort of model approaches talked about and discussed during the formation of the Building Safety Act, what we're finding out actually now is that there is a sort of dearth of how should it look. What are sort of examples? Are there examples, models, typical arrangements? What is it going to look like is what we're all struggling with. And so if anyone has any good advice on the panel, I would love to hear it.
And when we say it, we mean a building safety case report, maybe?
Fantastic, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it, and we're working with some clients currently to work through that, and we're learning as well. Key thing we're trying to do, and Judith might add to this as well, is to learn from other industries where safety cases essentially have originated. So heavy industry, offshore, nuclear, and then the concepts around trying to shift away from line-by-line compliance with things in a guidebook that tells you how a building should look if it fits these boxes, to understanding, first of all, not even the hazards, just the people in the building, how the building is used, and the actual lived experience, especially for existing buildings. That would be something that you would have an insight to, I guess, as well. And then working through what those hazards are, and really looking at the layers of protection, the things that would have to be in place and then could fail, and what might happen for different scenarios. And ultimately, we will have a lot of existing buildings, which is what we're talking about here, where we're adding in new hazards, and we have a big gap between what they've been designed as versus what the current guidance and even regulations would say. So we do need to step in there and really be engineers, and that's drawn on maybe new skills. We're working with our colleagues in risk and resilience that kind of look at these kind of concepts more commonly, and to reach a place of reasonable safety. And the key outcome isn't compliance with regs, it's with your client and with the owner of the buildings, identifying if we've taken all reasonable steps. That will become a bit challenging. Especially as you were saying earlier, in terms of resources that a particular organisation has to invest in safety, but you have to identify the measures and the pathways, and the timescales are then a separate discussion. But yeah, that's for us. It's not going to look like a fire risk assessment with a little extra chapter for structural. It's certainly not going to look like a fire strategy. It's going to really be looking at how the building will function in terms of hazards and layers of defence, and a discussion at the end with the owner and operator, the decision maker in that building.
I think it's a really interesting area because there's lots of guidance the HSE have issued around other safety case regimes about kind of risk probabilities and things like that. The problem with fire is it's actually quite a rare event, and we don't have many fires that involve multiple fatalities. So actually apportioning a risk number to that in terms of what you can reasonably be expected to do is really difficult, but we still need to do it. And that's something I think that we haven't managed to do yet, but the regulator, I'm sure, will be taking steps to try and kind of get out there. But I think there is a lot of guidance out there on the HSE's website around things like a hazard identification approach, that kind of thing. So it's taking that more holistic approach to risk and what could go wrong. I think I mentioned the layers of safety, but it is an interesting one, and it will require. So the fire safety order always required things like adapting to technical progress and being aware of other things. The safety case report really does act as a driver for that in terms of high-rise residential buildings, because it says if you haven't got these things in, why not? And think about doing it.
And if I can add, I think for me the important point also is to listen. So the engagement with residents is really important. It's hard work. It is important to pick them up at their knowledge level. So you need to change your language. You need to communicate in a different way. It is an opportunity to learn about how they perceive their buildings, whether we design something that actually works for them, or whether we are coming in with lots of you can't do this, you can't do that. That's not a successful building in my terms, right? We're designing them for people, and they need to work for people. And there are opportunities for us as a profession to also learn what we need to do differently. So in the future, we have buildings that actually serve people better. And so that takes a degree of just humbleness and just shut up and, see what they have to say. And I think there are broader opportunities that could come from that work, where if you have a longer term reasonable steps plan, you can then weave in other upgrade work. So we're in discussions about integrating safety and retrofit upgrades together. So if you have a strategy that actually allows proper budgeting for multiple years in advance, rather than kind of, oh, we've got a risk assessment action, we'll park it over there. And so there are different conversations that can be had through this process. The challenge is that it happens 18 meters and above. So we do need to tackle this on a much broader scale, because the retrofit challenge goes across all building heights, not just higher risk buildings.
You were interested in, apart from the building safety case report and the higher risk.
Oh, well, sorry.
So I consciously kind of focused in on a particular part of it.
There's a whole universe of questions I could bore everyone with, but an important part, I suppose, is part of the. Sorry, I'm getting my thoughts in order. Earlier, we were talking about buildings below 11 metres, and the building regulations say that you can use combustible insulation, I think, in those situations, but you have to take due consideration of the form arrangement, and I forget what the exact phrasing is, of the materials in the facade. Now, me as an architect, I am not a fire engineer, and so I can do my best. I can put fire cavity barriers in all the necessary places, but I would love to be able to use, for instance, compressed cellulose insulation in the right areas. But I don't have the expertise to do that, and actually, unfortunately, most fire engineers also, I think, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, don't have the expertise to design a detailed facade that incorporates that sort of insulation. So I'm just making a statement and sort of throwing it at you, but it'd be interesting to see how you thought we could address that sort of challenge. How do we train that number of fire engineers in that specialist area of construction to do that work?
Response, would be interested to hear what the guys say as well. As much as that's great, having lots of knowledge on how to design individual facade systems one by one and getting things right, or whatever right is. Like the point earlier with the different motivations for different property owners, we also need to have some benchmarks that lift all boats. Not every project needs a performance-based detailed design, and there isn't enough fire engineers to do that, and there never probably will be. We need to have some simple, clear rules and guidance that come quickly and are effective for what they do on day zero, not and they exist, and they can be refined and developed further as we need. But right now we have a lot of inertia around updating current codes and standards, and essentially our guidance is wildly behind. Not even talking about modern retrofit technologies, just how we build, particularly maybe facades. I mean, the type of things in our approved documents and British standards just don't really cover the way we want to build buildings. So we need to catch up on, I think, guidance and standardization as well as improving knowledge, and that's obviously the type of things you've mentioned, like cellulosic insulation. There's organic materials, all kinds of things beyond even the core ones.
Steel from abroad is a big. So there is. It's really important to look at what happens internationally, and initiatives that happen there. We can't reinvent the wheel here. We actually need to look at and see what we can borrow and steal from other countries that have got deemed to satisfy guidance that has really robust evidence base. So that's the important bit, right? You need to check what the background is. Has this just been organically developed, or is there a proper research basis behind it? But I think there are really interesting initiatives happening in Europe that we need to start looking at and see how much we can adopt that into the local practice. Absolutely. Do we have more questions? I think there were some more. Yes, excellent, thank you.
I'm Harriet, I'm an architect. I was interested to know, you mentioned sprinklers. If you have, for instance, Clarion, you have 90 buildings that are over 11 metres and around 6 stories, have you considered putting sprinklers in them, or do you think that's an unreasonably invasive thing to do? Or perhaps you think that there's something else you can do to mitigate any problem of escape?
I suppose so we have 90 buildings which are above 7 stories or above. So we have 450 buildings which are above 11 metres, and an additional 450. And within those, we've done 2 retrofits. For one we did as a sprinkler system, and one we did as a misting system. And I suppose what we learned from we knew the regulatory aspects of about what it would achieve. We also knew, I suppose, broadly that it would be a challenge. But the lessons we learned were that we were putting holes in every building all the way along, and we were really worried about, and that was really difficult to manage. Getting the water supply in the right place at the right time, having the right storage for it was really difficult. We also learned that lots and lots of people didn't want it. They didn't want to go into their homes. Despite this, we didn't charge for any of them. So, we did not. So if you're a leaseholder, we didn't charge for it. But people just did not want this in their homes. And then if you've got a building that's 2.4 meters from floor to soffit, and then you take that, whatever it is for the pipe work and the head, and then do you want a false ceiling in? You've got, I was almost touching the ceiling and that really, and that was a real real challenge. And it was like, when we looked at it, we thought it was going to cost about £4,000 or £5,000 per dwelling. Where we didn't put in the false ceilings, it turned out about 10k per dwelling. So you can sort of like, you sort of like, it ended up being a really difficult, challenging project. However, we put the misting system in because we wanted to learn about it, and it was actually a sheltered housing unit as well. So we thought it might, and it was really, we know now that we've done it in that building that actually we know that essentially the building's safer, that the residents in there are safer, and it makes a significant difference. It has made a significant difference because the regulatory regime doesn't immediately dive down that route of putting suppression systems in. It's moved us away to doing things that the regulatory regime does push it down the route of, routes for, like, remediating the external wall systems. So I suppose in conclusion, I'd say it's more expensive, it's harder to do, takes longer, but it has real benefits from a fire safety perspective. And, would I like to put them in all 90 buildings? Probably not. But would I like to put them in, a really significant proportion of that? I would say yes, I would. But that's got to be a long-term approach.
Thank you. There was another question there.
Hello, hello. I'm Albert Grant from Camden Building Control, where this building is. So, and as a person who's actually can deal with the actual coal face, the reality is, as you said, all regulations come in. You actually have to deal with whatever is in place. But where did those regulations come from? What is the basis, fundamental, origin of them that has built up after all these years, and it comes to this point, and then those regulations are still in place, right? So you're having all this discussion about retrofit and whatever. The fundamental thing is what out there as industry you're actually going to do. And the day, put an application in, I'm going to do something. What standards are you going to actually work to that you're responsible? As an approver, I'm not responsible. You're going to show that when it's HRBs, you're going to show that you've actually complied with the regulations. But do you actually know where they're coming from and what you're actually using to actually get to that point? That's sort of just, it's a rambling question, but the starting point is that it was based on the post-war building studies which developed, and so fire was the thing. But that was a Ministry of Works. They did the research. They went out and new materials were required. And so they had to actually research them and actually found out, yeah, we needed precast concrete to build more houses. So that's developed, and all is still there. And we've had a few changes in the regulation, British standards, but the fundamental approach to how you actually get a building is still there. All that's come in is the regime change of, as you said, the stick, which is you're going to go to jail. But the actual fundamental of how you actually build has not changed. I just want to see how you actually going to present. You're going to present your the reality.
Yeah, it's pretty largely me as a designer. That question, yeah, which is good. I mean, yes, I think it's on all fire engineers to understand the background to the regs and standards, because there has been quite a journey, and some of them haven't been made with very heads up, all pictures being considered decisions. We know that, for example, it's not related to this subject particularly, car parks being allowed to have 15 minutes fire resistance up to a height of 30 metres has not been driven by very, holistic safety considerations. That's been, a desire to build more steel car parks. So I think, we have to understand all of these with the different changes over time. I think Judith made a very good point earlier. There's been some things extracted from our guidance as well that we need to be aware of. We don't have deemed to satisfy solutions for a lot of ways to build buildings, and a lot of decisions have been left to designers to make good conscientious evidence-based decisions on. What the new regs will hopefully do will put a bit more onus on competency, showing that you're competent and doing that, so you can't just hide behind, well, I made a judgment and I was allowed to make a judgment because it's a guidance-based framework. So there's that component. And also, there'll be an evidence trail, and there's a lot more coming through that rather than just the Building Safety Act. We've got new controls on materials, obviously, and products, which will massively help at the back end of the system. We've got our new gateway processes, which will mean designs won't change in the same way as they might have in the past through value engineering. So I think there's a whole host of things that will mean that, yes, ultimately, to meet building regs requirements B1 to B5, and there's some guidance out there that will be the same core guidance until they're updated. But there's a lot more controls around poor and poorly intentioned design.
That's true. I think you were referring mainly to the approved documents there, weren't you? Which are only
guidance. What
yeah.
you can actually use.
Yeah.
I personally, some of them have a crack, but I actually every job, that's what is presented, and I'm going along with that. They said below 18 metres you can still use carcinogenic products in a fire. But I said, if that says there, where am I? Have they got BBA cert? Yeah, well, it says it meets the regulations, and that's what you're going to get a submission. If you're a designer, what are you going to put in? Are you going to present a BBA cert saying that is okay under 18 metres, that's perfectly okay?
Well, on that specific point, above and beyond guidance, and literally in the weeks and months after Grenfell, Arup made some pretty clear decisions around what we would use in buildings, and that was nicely actually showing up even in the public inquiry. There were communications between Arup and supply chain prior to Grenfell on what we think was a good idea to include in buildings. Obviously, we can give our advice, and the regulations are one thing and the guidance is another thing, and some clients can choose to agree with what we've advised them and some cannot. But we haven't changed our tune, and I think on things like combustible insulation, we don't put forward schemes here with combustible insulation.
So I think what you're alluding to in that is it's a fair challenge to designers is to really think about what it is that gets put together, and ADB does not hold the answer to everything. It is a bit like a Swiss cheese. There are lots of holes in it, and that is important when you're considering ultimately the functional requirements that we're designing to as to how you get there. And sometimes that means you need to go above and beyond to plug those holes, steal from other codes. I'm a very big fan of learning from other countries, and ultimately be comfortable with what you have designed and what your name will be under ultimately. I think you should be asking these questions. That those are questions we need to ask ourselves as designer, that we are cognizant of the background to the guidance that currently exists and the pace at which innovation happens, and that our standards really struggle to catch up and keep up.
Don't worry, artificial intelligence is going to resolve
Well, hopefully, we have some very exciting opportunities in the pipeline with Microsoft, so watch this space. I'm conscious of time. We have some drinks waiting outside, so I wanted to pose one last question to our panelists that I'm very interested to hear their answer on, which is, if you could set policy, and they have been prepped for this, so they know it's coming, what is the one thing you would change? Starting with maybe Richard this time around.
Dan said, sprinklers everywhere. We in the fire service we love a good sprinkler, and it does largely keep fires reduced, smaller, safer. So yeah.
Richard, number 2.
I think I would actually address the issue that we've just been discussing, which is to say that every standard, every rule has to start with what we are trying to achieve.
Dan?
Yeah, well, I think for me it's about, if I was to change one thing, it would be about putting retrofit and building safety together and say, look, you can't, if you're going to do something to make the building safer, you must make sure that you make the building more sustainable at the same time. And if we get, if we do that, then I think we've got, I think we'd have a really good chance of making progress.
Owen.
And me, I think I probably said it already, but I think it's a really powerful lever if we can shift the language in Regulation 3 and 4 from not making buildings any worse to, at a regulatory level, having to make reasonable changes. It can stimulate so much innovation and creativity in design solutions down through the chain.
Fabulous. Any last questions from the floor? Otherwise, I will release us to one more, 2 more. Okay. Last opportunity. I'm changing the script here as we go as well. So.
While we're getting the mic across, I just say as well, it was mentioned that Judith and I were involved along the research we talked about. Isaac is here. The green shirt in the front, happened to be in town, and has actually probably led most of the work on that.
Yeah. Cheers. Hi, I'm Will Bevington from Arup. Probably a question aimed at Dan more than anybody, but how much does the fairly complicated ownership structure of multi-residential buildings hold back A, retrofit, and B, the application of fire safety? You touched on it there, that some people just didn't want you to go into their buildings, but you obviously own all of your buildings, whereas a lot of ex-council stock, or some, it's a complete mixture of ownership structures.
I think that goes back to the, so we don't, because we've got a lot of ex-council stock that's in there. We build it, we have resident management committees who own the buildings. There are really complex ownership structures. I suppose where I think it would help, we'll go back to that point and say, do we understand our buildings and do we understand who owns which bits of the buildings and what those legal relationships are between all the different aspects? And if we understood that, then it's not just fixing it from a technical perspective, but fixing it from a legal perspective. You know that, I mentioned that we didn't charge for the suppression system that we installed, and and that's just because we sort of knew it would be too difficult to sort of like to get it. That would probably take us as much effort to get people to pay a proportion for it as it would actually the real big effort it took to actually install the suppression system. So I think a clearer understanding of what those legal relationships are is where I would start with that.
So, very last question. Thank you, Dan.
Hi, my name is Tim Alain. I'm a third-year civil engineering student currently on my placement year. So I think earlier Richard Clarks mentioned that a lot of buildings aren't constructed in the way that they should be, thus making them more susceptible to fires. So what I would like to know is, what are the 3 main factors that make high-rise social housing susceptible to fires in terms of its construction from your experience?
I suppose it is things like construction. So, the big ticket item has always been the external cladding, which we all know the history around that. But as part of that, it was found, and a lot of the remediation is once that cladding was taken off, there were gaps in the compartmentation within the building. The building compartmentation, separation is one of the key things. I think the other thing is things like maintenance of buildings. So one of the regret to say, the least interesting areas of buildings is often fire doors, but they're actually the most important in a lot of times because that's the thing that allows escape routes to be used and keeps fire and smoke back. But historically, they've not been well looked after. We've got new regulations now, the fire safety and regulations last year certainly put in place that a landlord needs to review them and look after them much more. And then the third bit would be management. So we often build buildings to not be managed. So approved document B, there's a paragraph at the beginning that says you've got to design a building so it can be managed, but we don't necessarily understand what that means. So certainly the new regulatory regime has in place this idea of a fire and emergency file, which actually outlines from the initial stages of a building how that building should be managed, what you should do to look at how that happens, which is quite new. Well, it's not new, but it's quite different from what it was before, and it puts in place the fact that you can't just put a building up and leave all the management bit for later on. So our experience in the fire service is often you get an architect who designs a lovely, pretty building. They then realise it doesn't meet the code, so then they get a fire engineer to kind of excuse that design and just write some fancy words which say, yeah, it can be occupied, we'll just put it onto the management at the end. The new regime says actually an architect should be engaging a fire engineer a lot earlier. The fire engineer is going to have to sign something to say, I'm competent and I'm a designer and I understand this. And then the fire and emergency file has to go together, which outlines the expectations of how that's going to be managed in future. And part of the sign-off process for Gateway 3 will be an acceptance of that by the clients, that's how they're going to manage it. So hopefully that will be a good change.
Fabulous. We're over time. So I would like to thank our panelists for the discussions and every one of you here for being here and your very good questions. I think what's come out very clearly is that there is no simple answer in this. We are very much dealing with a very complex and messy problem where we need to recognize that there's a lot we don't understand about our buildings, that we want to create more energy efficient systems. We have a lot of legacy issues that we have an opportunity to improve on if we choose to do that and set much clearer signals. But we are seeing insufficient maturity in the supply chain. We're seeing some new products coming through, but maybe not enough. And the important point really is to share learning and learn from our past mistakes. So we can, in the future, as we do need to accelerate this very significantly, make sure that we don't repeat the errors and mistakes we have done in the past. And I think we have all the ingredients and knowledge to do that. So thank you for being here tonight. It's been a pleasure to exchange ideas and discussions, and be pleased if you join us outside for a drink or two if you have time. Thank you.